He thought it was just another shift as a paramedic until a desperate 911 call led him to the penthouse of tech billionaire Julian Cross. Saving his life was only the beginning, because Julian wasn't just grateful, he was intrigued. Like and subscribe for more unexpected love stories that hit hard and move fast. The sirens howled into the night like a living thing, slicing through the stillness of Manhattan's upper skyline. Liam Carter kept his grip firm on the steering wheel as the ambulance climbed past midnight traffic, his jaw clenched tight. The voice from dispatch still rang in his ears, urgent and clipped. Unresponsive mail. Suspected cardiac arrest. No entry to the residence. Top floor of Cross Tower. The name hadn't registered at first, not until his partner Danny muttered it under her breath, low like a prayer or a curse. Cross Tower, as in Julian Cross, billionaire, tech genius. The kind of man whose name lived on magazine covers and business podcasts. Not someone Liam had ever expected to meet, much less revive. But none of that mattered now. All Liam could think about was the golden second they were losing every minute this man's heart wasn't beating. Each floor the elevator climbed stretched thinner than the last, and Liam could feel the weight of time pressing against his ribcage like a second heartbeat. His medbag felt heavier in his hand than usual. Too heavy. The kind of heavy that meant you were walking into something big, maybe something final. The elevator opened with a soft chime onto the top floor. The penthouse door loomed in front of them, sleek and black, locked tight. There was no doorman in sight, no house staff, no visible entry point. Danny tried the call button beside the door, her fingers flying, her voice calm but quick. Nothing. No answer. Liam took a step back, gauged the hinges, and then, without waiting for approval, kicked the door open. The impact of his boot echoed through the marble foyer, followed by a gust of chilled, climate-controlled air scented faintly of bergamot and pine. It hit him first too clean, too quiet. Something wasn't right. Homes didn't sound like that when someone inside was dying. They swept in, shoes silent on polished floors, calling out. Their voices disappeared into the hush of the apartment like stones dropped into deep water. Then, a sound. A soft, rhythmic beeping, broken and irregular. Liam followed it like a hunter on instinct, weaving past expensive furniture and into the heart of the penthouse. Julian Cross lay on the floor near a grand piano, collapsed onto one side. His skin was pale as candle wax, a cold sheen of sweat slicking his brow. His chest barely moved. Liam dropped beside him, already moving, 2 fingers to the carotid. Faint. Almost nothing. Danny handed him the AED without a word, her face calm but her eyes tight with urgency. Liam peeled Julian's shirt open, revealing a chest marked by old scars and newer onosurgical, precise, deliberate. A man who had faced death before, and not just once. The pads adhered with a soft sound. The machine came to life. Analyze, Shock advised. Liam's fingers trembled as they hovered over the button, but his voice was steady. Clear. Julian's body jerked as the shock hit him. Silence followed, the kind that felt like the world waiting to exhale. Then, another beep. Steady this time. Faint, but there. Liam pressed his hand against Julian's chest, felt the flutter of a pulse beneath his palm like something waking up. Alive. Barely, but alive. Julian's eyes opened a moment later, just a flicker, then a flutter, blue eyes, cold and sharp like cracked ice, but softening when they locked on Liam. It lasted less than 2 seconds, just long enough for something to shift in the room, for the silence to take on a new shape. Julian's lips moved. No sound came, but Liam saw it. One word. You. And then he was unconscious again. The ambulance ride was a blur. Machines humming, Donnie talking into the radio, vitals being called out like a prayer. But Liam couldn't stop staring at the man strapped to the gurney, his body stabilized, oxygen pumping, IV flowing. It should have felt like any other save, one of hundreds, but it didn't. Not this time. At the hospital, a team of doctors descended on Julian like bees on a dying flower. They whisked him away without so much as a thank you. Liam stood in the hall, his gloves still on, Julian's sweat drying on his forearms. He should have left then, should have cleaned up and headed back to the rig, but something rooted him to the floor. Something about the way Julian had looked at him, not with fear, not even with gratitude. With recognition. It made no sense. They had never met. Liam would have remembered. A man like Julian Cross wasn't easy to forget. Later, back at the station, the city still humming just outside the garage doors, Danny handed him a coffee and stared at him over the rim of her cup. "You okay?" He nodded, but it was a lie. "You're not okay." He rubbed his face. The image of Julian's pale skin and faint smile burned behind his eyelids like a bruise. "I've never had one look at me like that," he admitted. "Like I meant something. Like he knew me." Danny raised a brow. "It's probably the hypoxia. Maybe." He didn't believe it. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. His body was exhausted, but his mind was electric, replaying every second. The door splintering under his boot, the silence of the penthouse, Julian's heartbeat flickering like a dying candle, that look. The city murmured outside his window, sirens and traffic, and the occasional laughter of people who still had somewhere to be. Liam stared at the ceiling and wondered what it meant when a man came back from the edge and the first thing he saw was you. He didn't know it yet, but the man he saved would soon call him again, not out of emergency, but out of something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Julian woke to the steady hiss of oxygen and the antiseptic scent that always clung to hospital rooms. The light was too bright, too white, like a blade pressing against his closed eyelids. He blinked once, twice, then opened them fully, greeted by the sterile outlines of ceiling panels and the soft mechanical beeping that insisted, quietly, that he was still alive. The realization washed over him like cold water. He felt it in his chest first, a dull pressure where his ribs ached from compressions. His skin was sticky with sweat, cool against the hospital sheets. Breathing came easier now, though he felt the weight of fatigue in his limbs, as though his blood had been replaced with wet sand. The monitor beside him blinked steadily, his vitals. Proof, not a dream, not yet another imagined failure. He turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, and found the room empty. The leather visitor's chair beside his bed sat untouched. The glass of water on the tray table still held condensation, untouched, unloved, no friends, no family, just wires and the low hum of hospital machinery. The image of the man came back to him in fragments, like catching someone in flashes between trees on a foggy path. Strong hands on his chest, a voice sharp with command but grounded with calm. Eyes like stormy sky, relentless and locked to his, even as Julian drifted toward nothing. The name had slipped by in the chaos. He had tried to ask. Had he imagined speaking? He had seen so many faces in his life, but that one, that man, something about him hadn't let go. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something older, stranger, like his body had remembered something his mind couldn't reach. He lifted his hand, slow and unsure, and found the call button. He pressed it once, and within moments a nurse stepped in, her expression neutral, professional, kind in that practiced way. "You're awake," she said. "That's good. Who brought me in?" His voice cracked, hoarse from intubation. "The paramedic. Who was he?" The nurse hesitated just long enough for Julian to catch it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not sure. I can try to find out for you." He nodded, though he already knew he would be making that call himself. Connections had always come easy. The man who had saved his life had unknowingly stepped into Julian's orbit, and Julian did not let go of things that mattered. Not anymore. Not after coming that close to the end again. He drifted in and out over the next few hours. Nurses came and went. Doctors made their rounds, spoke in softened tones about arrhythmias and stress-related complications, about a follow-up schedule and medication. He listened. He nodded. But none of it held his attention like the memory of the man's face. Back in his penthouse 2 days later, Julian sat wrapped in a blanket far too warm for the summer evening. The towering glass windows framed the city in gold and steel. From this height, it all looked peaceful. Below, people hurried and pushed and lived without knowing how close the world came to swallowing them whole. His assistant, Evelyn, stood nearby, tablet in hand. "I found him," she said. Julian turned slowly, the blanket slipping down one shoulder. "Liam Carter, EMT, 5 years with the department, Bronx native, worked in Midtown since last spring. Clean record, survived a building fire 3 years ago, lost his fiancée." The words hit like gentle blows, pieces of a person forming shape. "Do you want to reach out officially?" Evelyn asked. "A letter? Donation to the department?" "No," Julian said quietly. "I want to see him." She studied him a moment, her brow knitting. "That might be complicated." Julian reached for the tablet, scrolling through a photo attached to the personnel file. The face matched the memory, though it looked harder in the still frame, more guarded, less alive. He wondered if Liam always wore that armor. "I'll handle it," Julian said, his voice low. "Set me up for that fundraiser next week. The firefighters' benefit, Midtown coverage. You haven't gone to one of those in years." "I'm going this time." The night of the event came quickly. The ballroom at the Grand Colton Hotel shimmered with the expensive sheen of old money and polished reputation. Julian moved through the crowd with the grace of a man who understood how to wear power like a second skin. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly, his cufflinks gleamed, and yet, beneath it all, his pulse quickened like a teenager's. Not from nerves, from anticipation. He saw Liam before Liam saw him. The EMT was across the room, in a charcoal suit that looked like it had been borrowed but pressed with care. He stood beside a woman with sharp eyes and a crooked smile, his sister, perhaps. They were laughing about something. The sound reached Julian before the words did, and something inside him ached. Liam turned then, as if drawn, and their eyes met again. Not as strangers, not as patient and paramedic, as men who had both stood at the edge. Julian waited, gave Liam the choice, and Liam stepped forward. They met near the open bar, surrounded by the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. "I didn't expect to see you here," Liam said, voice even, but Julian caught the edge of wariness. "I wanted to thank you," Julian replied. "In person, privately." "You already did, with your eyes, that night." Julian smiled, a small thing, real. "Then maybe I wanted to see if I imagined that connection." "You didn't," Liam said, then looked away, as if the admission had cost him something. "But that doesn't mean it's anything." "Maybe not," Julian agreed. "But what if it is?" Liam looked at him then, fully, as if trying to see past the money, the name, the legend that preceded Julian like a second shadow. He must have seen something that made him stay, because he didn't leave. They stood shoulder to shoulder as the speeches began, as the wine flowed, as the city pressed itself against the windows outside. When Julian asked him to coffee the next day, Liam hesitated, just long enough to make Julian wonder. Then he said yes. The cafe was tucked into a quiet corner of the West Village, a narrow sliver of warmth between a vintage bookstore and a flower shop spilling blooms across the sidewalk. The windows fogged slightly from the inside, catching the cool bite of early autumn air. Inside, the scent of espresso and cinnamon danced in the close space, curling into the corners like whispers. Julian had arrived early, his nerves masked beneath a crisp cashmere coat and a scarf too fine for the weather. He sat at a small table near the window, watching the world pass by in muted rhythm. Every footstep outside, every flicker of movement made him lift his gaze in quiet expectation. He hated this feeling, this not knowing. He had spent years building an empire on control, on logic, on precision, and yet here he was, heart unsettled, pulse speaking a language older than reason. When Liam walked in, the bell over the door gave a soft chime, and the room, to Julian's ears, hushed for a breath. He wasn't dressed like he had been at the fundraiser. Gone was the stiff suit, replaced by a worn jacket, the collar turned up against the chill, and dark jeans that clung to his legs in a way Julian tried not to look at too long. His eyes were alert, thoughtful, scanning the room like he was assessing risk, like he was stepping into something unknown. Their eyes met, and Julian rose from his seat, his movement smooth and practiced. He offered a small smile, something careful and real, and Liam approached with the slow caution of a man who had learned not to trust kindness without reason. Julian gestured to the chair across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Liam shrugged as he sat, brushing a few drops of rain from his sleeve. "I wasn't either." A pause stretched between them, soft but taut. Julian let it live there, resisting the urge to fill it with noise. He had learned that silence, in the right company, could be more intimate than words. A server approached and took their order's black coffee for Liam, cappuccino for Julian. The clink of cups, the gentle hum of other conversations gave them privacy. Liam looked down at his hands, then out the window. "You're not what I expected." "Disappointed?" Liam's lips curved faintly. "Still deciding." Julian leaned in slightly, the edge of his scarf brushing the table. "What did you expect?" "Someone cold," Liam said. "Distant. You're not that." Julian took a sip of his cappuccino, the foam warm and sweet on his lips. "You're not what I expected either." "You mean a first responder who doesn't want to be thanked with a press release and a photo op?" "No," Julian said, his voice softer now. "I mean someone who sees through all of this." He watched Liam process that, watched the way his jaw flexed, the flicker in his eyes like a match being struck. There was something about the man's stillness, the way he held himself like a fortress. Julian had known men like that before, but never one who made him want to know what was behind the walls. "You weren't supposed to be home," Liam said after a moment. "That night." "I wasn't. Last-minute change. Canceled a meeting. I couldn't sleep. Maybe some part of me knew." "You think like that?" Liam asked. "Fate and instinct?" Julian hesitated. "Only recently." Liam looked at him then, truly looked, and something shifted again, the air between them growing heavier, more electric. "I keep thinking about the way you looked at me," Julian said, "right before you went under again, like you knew me." "I felt something," Liam admitted, "which is insane because I've saved a lot of lives. That's the job. You go in, you stabilize, you move on. But you looked at me like—" He trailed off. "Like I mattered," Julian finished. Liam nodded once, silent. They sat like that for a moment, the world around them moving on, unaware of the gravity pressing inward between two people who had only just met and yet not. Julian set his cup down slowly. "I've built a life out of logic. I designed systems, networks, code that could predict behavior better than most humans. But nothing in my life, not money, not data, prepared me for what it felt like to be that close to death and wake up to someone who made me feel alive again in a single breath." Liam blinked, and Julian saw it there, the fracture, the place where the armor cracked. "I lost someone," Liam said finally, voice quiet. 3 years ago, fire call. I was on scene. Couldn't get him out. We were engaged." Julian felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry." Liam nodded, swallowing hard. "So when I say I don't do this kind of thing, I mean it. I don't date. I don't talk about feelings in cafes. And I sure as hell don't get coffee with billionaires I pull off the floor of a penthouse. Julian reached across the table then, slowly, his hand open, resting palm up between them. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, he said. But I would like to see you again. Not because you saved my life. Because when I look at you, I don't feel like Julian Cross. I feel like a man who could finally stop pretending he's fine. Liam looked down at the hand, then back at Julian's eyes. He didn't take the hand, but he didn't pull away either. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, streaking the glass with slow silver trails. Inside, the warmth grew between them. Not yet a fire, but something waiting to catch. Liam stood first, tucking his jacket closed. I need time, he said. I'll wait, Julian replied, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything. Liam hesitated, then gave him the barest nod, like a promise whispered only to himself. He left the cafe without another word, the bell above the door chiming once, fading into the storm. Julian remained at the table long after his cappuccino had gone cold, the taste of Liam's presence still alive in the air around him. Julian stood at the edge of the rooftop garden, Manhattan sprawling out before him like a restless sea of light and motion. The sky had slipped into a deep indigo, the last threads of dusk clinging to the western horizon. His breath curled faintly in the crisp air, scented with jasmine and lavender from the planter boxes lining the terrace walls. The city below pulsed with life, but up here it was quiet, almost reverent. He heard the elevator doors open behind him and turned just as Liam stepped out. He was dressed simply dark sweater, jeans, boots that had seen better years, but somehow he carried himself like someone who belonged wherever he stood. Julian felt his pulse shift, subtle and insistent. You're early, Julian said, offering a smile that felt too small for the size of what he was feeling. Liam shrugged, his gaze moving past Julian to the skyline. Didn't feel like waiting. Julian nodded and stepped aside to let him take in the view. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, not speaking, just letting the silence stretch between them like a held breath. I forget how quiet it can get up here, Liam said after a moment, his voice low. Almost like the city isn't real. It's too easy to believe it's something you control when you're this high up, Julian replied. Down there it's different, Messier, more honest. Liam turned toward him then, eyes catching the amber light spilling from the lanterns, strung along the terrace railing. That why you invited me here instead of a restaurant? I didn't want noise, Julian said. I wanted real. Liam watched him for a long beat, then gave a small nod. Then let's have real. Julian led him inside, through the warm curve of the penthouse where soft jazz played low on hidden speakers, and the dining table gleamed under a halo of dimmed light. The scent of roasted garlic and fresh basil drifted in from the open kitchen where a private chef worked silently, focused but unobtrusive. Dinner was served in courses that neither of them paid much attention to. They picked at grilled vegetables and risotto, with roasted tomatoes, and sipped wine that Julian had brought up from the cellar just for this night. But their attention rarely drifted to the plates. It stayed locked on the space between them, a charged current building with each word, each glance. Julian found himself laughing more than he had in months. Not the forced kind he reserved for board meetings and galas, but something looser, something closer to joy. Liam had a dry wit and a way of cutting through pretension that made Julian feel like someone worth being known. When dessert came thin, slices of pear soaked in honey and lavender, Liam leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You're not what I thought, he said quietly. Julian lifted an eyebrow, sipping his wine. Still deciding? No, Liam said. I think I decided somewhere between the second course and your story about crashing your first software demo in front of a senator. Julian grinned, sheepish. My most glamorous moment. It made you human, Liam said. I like that version of you. Julian set his glass down, fingers curling around the stem. He doesn't get out much. You should let him. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something neither was ready to name, but both had already begun to feel. Julian stood, pushing back his chair. "Come with me." He led Liam down a hallway, dimly lit, with recessed floor lights. The walls were bare except for one black and white photograph of the Hudson River in winter, ice glinting like shards of glass. They stopped outside a room with no door, just a wide entry framed by dark wood. Julian stepped inside first, flicking on a single low light. The space was nothing like the rest of the penthouse. Where the rest of the home whispered wealth and curated precision, this room was raw and personal. A small upright piano sat in the corner, well used and slightly scuffed. Sketches littered the wallsome abstract, some clearly drawn by an unpracticed hand. A pile of books lay beside a worn armchair, their spines bent and pages dog-eared. "This is where I go when I need to disappear," Julian said. "No cameras, no press, just me." Liam stepped into the room slowly, his gaze moving from the piano to the sketches to Julian. "It feels like someone else lives here." "Maybe he does," Julian said. "Maybe he's just waiting to be let out." Liam crossed to the piano and touched one key lightly. The note echoed through the room, simple and whole. "Do you play?" "Only when I think no one's listening." "I won't tell," Liam said, his smile a ghost against the shadows. Julian stepped closer, stopping just in front of him. The air between them shifted, thickened. The hum of the city faded until there was only the space of a breath between their chests. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "Since that night." Liam's eyes didn't move, didn't flinch. "You almost died, and somehow that made everything clearer." Julian reached out then, fingers brushing the side of Liam's face. His skin was warm, a little rough beneath the stubble. Liam didn't move away. Their lips met with a slow certainty, not urgent, but full of weight. Like both men knew exactly what they were risking. Julian tasted coffee and the faintest trace of cinnamon. Liam's hands found Julian's waist, steady and sure, as if grounding them both. When they broke apart, breath mingling in the closed space, Liam didn't speak. He only leaned in again, forehead resting against Julian's. Julian closed his eyes. For a moment, the world was only warmth and silence and the quiet miracle of being held. They moved through the rest of the night with unspoken rhythm. Clothes shed like burdens, piece by piece, touches slow and reverent. Julian learned the shape of Liam's back, the slope of his shoulder, the shiver that moved through him when fingers traced the scar near his hip. Liam moved like someone who had once known love and now only remembered the ache of it, like a song almost forgotten. After, they lay tangled in linen and shadow, their bodies cooling against one another. Liam's voice broke the stillness. "I don't do this." "I know," Julian whispered, "and I can't promise it means anything." Julian's hand found his. "But it does." Liam said nothing, but he didn't pull away. And in the dark, with the hum of the city far below, Julian let himself hope that this time it would be enough. Morning came slowly, slipping into the penthouse with the gentle insistence of sunlight drawn through gauzy curtains. The light painted golden fingers across the oak floors and climbed gradually over tangled sheets, warming bare skin and casting long shadows that stretched like secrets across the room. A breeze whispered through a cracked window, stirring the silk drapes and carrying the faint scent of city rain drying on concrete. Julian stirred first. His eyes opened into a world softened by sleep, his senses thick and heavy with memory. The room felt different now, the kind of different that lingered in your bones, like an echo that refused to fade. He turned his head slightly, expecting to find Liam still beside him, drawn in shadow and sunlight. But the bed was empty, the sheets beside him still faintly warm but already cooling. A hollow had been left behind in the mattress, and in it Julian felt the beginning of something familiar, the chill of absence. He sat up slowly, the sheet falling from his chest. His body ached in a way that was both physical and not. It was the ache of vulnerability, of being opened and not yet sealed. He scanned the room, eyes landing on the clothes missing from the floor, the silence already grown too wide. The glass of water on the nightstand sat untouched. Julian slid his feet to the floor and stood, wrapping a robe loosely around himself as he moved through the penthouse. The air held the remnants of the night before salt from his skin, a trace of Liam's cologne clinging to the hallway like a memory in midair. The scent caught in Julian's throat, stirred something raw beneath his sternum. He found a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in quick, slanted handwriting on the back of an old receipt. No greeting, no goodbye, just 3 words. "I'm not ready." Julian stared at the note until the letters blurred, not from tears, but from the sudden rush of heat in his chest. He pressed the paper flat against the countertop, fingers trembling. He wanted to be angry, to feel used, discarded, but the emotion that rose first wasn't anger. It was grief. The quiet, familiar grief of loss that never quite learned how to knock. He didn't try to call, didn't message. He had chased things before, companies, ideas, people, and the results had always been the same. This time, he let the silence sit. The day passed with the slow rhythm of routine pretending to be distraction. He read through emails with eyes that didn't register words. Meetings came and went in a blur of talking heads and glowing graphs. He ate a meal he didn't taste. By evening, the penthouse had returned to its usual state of curated stillness, and Julian felt smaller within it than he ever had. The city outside bloomed with evening lights, but Julian stayed in the dark. He sat by the window, a glass of scotch in hand, watching people cross streets, hail cabs, lean into each other with the quiet intimacy of lovers and friends. And he felt, not for the first time, that his life had become a stage too high above the ground. No matter how much he built or gave or transformed, there remained this unreachable thing inside him that no empire could touch. It wasn't until 2 days later that he saw Liam again. Not in person, not by design. It was a photograph. A blurry, long lens shot on one of those celebrity gossip websites Julian usually ignored. But his name had been trending, and his PR team had flagged it, concerned. He clicked the link with a strange sense of inevitability. The photo showed the two of them leaving the cafe from the week before. Julian in his coat, Liam just behind him, shoulders slightly hunched. Nothing overt, nothing intimate. But the headline did not require fact. It only required flame. Billionaire savior. Who's the mystery man stealing Julian Cross's heart? He stared at the image. Liam's face half turned, caught in motion, unreadable, and then below it, a growing storm of speculation. Comments, questions, opinions thrown like stones into water, some praising, some cruel, all invasive. His phone rang minutes later. Evelyn, "We're already drafting a statement," she said, her voice brisk but careful. "If you want to deny the relationship, we'll do it delicately. You can say he was your paramedic, that's all. No harm done." Julian was silent on the other end of the line. "Julian?" Evelyn's voice softened. He leaned his head back against the wall, staring up at the ceiling, where a fine crack had begun to form near the corner. "I'm not denying anything," he said at last. "Then you know what's coming," she replied. "The board will ask questions. Shareholders will panic. The media will hound him." "I know," Julian said. "But I won't lie. Not about this." He ended the call and sat in the quiet for a long time. Later that night, with the city restless and breathing beyond the glass, Julian pulled out a small drawer in his desk. Inside were relics. He rarely touched old photos. A thumb drive containing his first ever prototype. A handwritten letter from his father folded so many times the paper had begun to fray. He added Liam's note to it, folding it once, carefully, and placing it among the fragments of his private life. In a different apartment across town, Liam sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, the same photo glowing on the screen. The comments blurred beneath his fingers. Friends had already started texting. His lieutenant had asked for a meeting. The chief wanted to speak to him personally. The department didn't like stories. They liked neatness, professionalism, quiet dignity. And Liam had none of that left right now. He thought about the way Julian had looked at him the night they met again, like he wasn't afraid to be seen. He thought about the warmth of Julian's hands, the steadiness of his voice, the way his presence had softened the silence Liam usually lived inside. He closed the photo and set the phone down. Then he leaned back onto the mattress, eyes on the ceiling, heart racing in that sharp, silent way it did, when the choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between safe and true. He had walked away. But now, the whole world had seen them together, and the question that burned brightest wasn't how to hide it. It was whether he still had the courage to stop running. The days that followed unfolded like a fever dream, each one more surreal than the last. Liam moved through his hours with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to feel too much. He went to work, took calls, wrapped bandages, carried stretchers. He smiled when required, gave curt nods when his name was mentioned too loudly in the break room, and answered his supervisor's cautious questions with clipped professionalism. But beneath the surface, a quiet storm had begun to churn. The photo had done its damage. The whispers came first. Co-workers who had always been cordial now paused a beat too long before speaking, eyes flicking toward him and away again. The men and women who used to slap him on the back after a call now offered stiff nods or silence. The atmosphere inside the ambulance bay shifted. It became heavier, close, like all the air had been pulled out and replaced with static. Liam tried not to let it in. He told himself it would pass. Headlines moved on. People forgot. But then came the meeting. He was called into the chief's office, a narrow room with a cracked vinyl couch and a coat rack that always leaned slightly to one side. Chief Mathers sat behind a desk littered with old reports and a half-eaten granola bar. His brow was furrowed, his hands clasped tightly together. "I'm not here to judge your personal life," Mathers began. "That's not my business." Liam sat stiffly, hands resting on his knees. "But it becomes my business when the department ends up on gossip sites, when donors start asking questions, when people want to know why one of our EMTs is apparently dating one of the richest men in the city." Liam said nothing. Mathers sighed, leaned back in his chair. "You didn't do anything wrong, but you have to understand. The optics matter. Public perception matters." "I didn't ask for the attention," Liam said quietly. "Doesn't matter if you asked," the chief replied. "It found you." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When he slid it across the desk, Liam hesitated before picking it up. It was an offer. A reassignment, temporary leave, paid, to let things cool down, the chief said. Liam didn't know what made his chest tighten more, the careful politeness of the language or the implication beneath it. You're not in trouble, but you're not welcome either. He left the building with the letter burning in his pocket, and a hollowness beneath his ribs he hadn't felt in years. The last time he had felt it, he was watching flames consume everything he loved. That night, he didn't go home. He wandered the city instead, letting the streets pull him along. He moved through the noise like a ghost, each light too bright, each voice too loud. He bought a coffee he didn't drink, sat on a bench in the park and watched the leaves swirl in early autumn wind. He thought of Julian, of the rooftop garden and the room with the piano, of the way Julian had looked at him like he wasn't broken. And then, because he couldn't help himself, he pulled out his phone and typed a message. "I need to see you." He hovered over the send button for a long time, thumb trembling, and then, before he could stop himself, he hit send. Julian responded within 5 minutes. "Come over. Now." The penthouse was lit low when Liam arrived. No staff, no guards, just Julian waiting by the window in a soft navy sweater, barefoot, a glass of something dark in one hand. When Liam stepped inside, the city fell away. They didn't speak at first. Julian set his drink down and crossed the room slowly, his movements quiet and deliberate. When he reached Liam, he didn't ask what had happened. He didn't demand explanations or apologies. He just opened his arms. Liam stepped into the embrace and let his body sink into the warmth. Julian's chest was solid against his hand cradling the back of Liam's head with surprising gentleness. The silence held them like a shelter. "I'm sorry," Liam said into the fabric of Julian's shirt. "I ran. I didn't know what else to do." "I know," Julian whispered. "And I'm here." They pulled apart slowly, just enough to look at each other. "They asked me to take leave," Liam said. "Said it would help." Julian's jaw tightened. "That's not helping. That's pushing you out." Liam shrugged. "It's better than losing the job." Julian stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. He turned, walked to the bar, poured a second drink with a heavy hand. "I didn't want this to touch you," Julian said. "I thought if I didn't deny it, if I just lived it, the storm would pass." "You were honest," Liam said. "That matters." "To us, maybe," Julian said. "But the world doesn't care about honest. It cares about image, about stories." He turned, and there was a kind of tiredness in his eyes that Liam hadn't seen before. A weariness carved from years of being watched, interpreted, consumed. "Then maybe we rewrite the story," Liam said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. Julian looked at him, really looked, and the moment was thick with unspoken possibility. "Come with me," Julian said. "Now, just for a little while." "Where?" "Anywhere that isn't here." Liam hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he nodded. They packed quickly. No suits, no watches, just a few changes of clothes, a pair of boots, a weathered duffel bag Liam hadn't used since the academy. Julian made a call to his driver, then another to cancel his meetings for the next 3 days. By midnight, they were on the road, the city shrinking in the rearview mirror. The sky was dark, the stars few and far between, but for the first time in days, Liam felt like he could breathe. Julian sat beside him, one hand resting palm up on the center console. Liam reached out slowly and laid his hand over Julian's. They didn't speak again until the road curved into forest, and the air changed from metallic city dust to pine and earth. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt sacred. Julian's voice was soft when he finally broke it. "You're not alone in this." And in the hush that followed, Liam believed him, not because the world had grown kinder, but because something between them had become real enough to fight for. Rain whispered against the glass walls of the conference room like a secret being told over and over, one that no one dared speak aloud. Julian sat at the head of the long table, eyes fixed on a presentation he wasn't really seeing, the slides flickering across the screen with lifeless precision. Charts, projections, market analysis, it all blurred into a distant hum behind the rushing tide of his thoughts. His fingers rested on the smooth wood of the table, one thumb slowly tracing the grain in a steady circle. Outside, the city hunched beneath a silver sky, the outlines of buildings softened by mist. Inside, the air was tight with tension. His executive team sat in careful rows, postures too straight, eyes too polite. No one dared meet his gaze for long. It had been 3 weeks since the photo. In that time, his name had danced through headlines like fire through dry grass. Board members had called. Investors had questioned his judgment. The whispers had started to shape themselves into sharper things. Distraction, weakness, vulnerability. The very traits Julian had spent a decade building immunity against were now seeping through the cracks. He had ignored most of it, pushed back with strategy and silence, but the pressure hadn't let up. And now here he was, listening to a cybersecurity officer explain something about internal risk protocols when the door opened and everything inside him froze. Evelyn stepped in, her face pale, eyes wide. She moved quickly to his side, leaned in low so only he could hear. "You need to come with me. Now." The tone of her voice, firm and shaking at once, dropped his heart into his stomach. He rose without a word. ignored the startled glances that followed him as he strode out of the room and into the hallway. "What happened?" he asked as soon as the door closed behind them. "There's been a breach. Your personal servers. Not just the company's network. They got into your private files, financials, legal documents, emails, and medical records." Julian stopped walking. "Medical records?" She nodded. "Including the cardiac files, everything from the night of the arrest." He felt the floor shift slightly beneath him, though his feet hadn't moved. The moment narrowed. The walls seemed to close in. "Do we know who?" "Not yet," Evelyn said. "But they knew what to look for. This wasn't random." They moved quickly to the secure office suite, where a smaller tech team had already begun assembling around screens, glowing with frantic energy. Julian didn't speak. He watched, listened. Names of suspected hacker groups were tossed around, strategies for countermeasures, speculation about motives. It all settled in his gut like lead. One name kept rising again and again. A competitor. A man who had once tried to buy Julian out of a merger and been denied. Someone with too many resources and too few scruples. Julian sat still as the facts took shape around him. He wasn't just being targeted because of the photo. This was something more. A calculated effort to shake him, to pull him apart piece by piece in the eyes of his investors and the world. And it was working. The stress didn't come all at once. It trickled in slowly, subtly, like smoke from a room you didn't yet know was burning. A tightness in his chest. The beginning of a headache he couldn't quite place. A strange flutter under his ribs. But Julian pushed through it, as he always had, because that was what survival looked like to him. You moved forward. You did not show weakness. You did not break. But sometime around 3 in the afternoon, just as Evelyn handed him a summary of exposed files, Julian's vision swam. He blinked, hard, trying to clear it, but the blur grew sharper, the edges of things doubling and twisting. The room tilted slightly. Then came the wave-deep and nauseating, like his own body was pulling inward. His hands trembled. Heat rose under his collar. He heard Evelyn call his name, far away, felt her hand on his shoulder, but her voice was swallowed by the rising rush in his ears, the sound of his heart stumbling over itself. One beat. Pause. Then a thud that echoed through his chest with jarring force. He collapsed. He fell sideways, not fully conscious, his mind flashing not with fear but with Liam's face, the shape of his smile in the half-dark, the sound of his voice saying, "I'm not ready," the warmth of his hand in the car that night as they drove into the woods. Then everything disappeared. He came to in a hospital room. The same scent as before, the same beeping, the same too-white light that made his teeth ache. But this time, there was a hand already wrapped around his, strong, solid, familiar. Liam. Julian turned his head slowly, eyes blinking away the blear, and saw him. Liam sat beside the bed in a borrowed hoodie, face drawn, eyes rimmed with worry. "You're awake," Liam said, voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding. Julian tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Don't talk," Liam said quickly, leaning in to help him with the straw in the water cup. "You scared the hell out of everyone." Julian sipped, swallowed, closed his eyes. "How did you know?" he managed, rasping the words. "I saw it on the news," Liam said. "Before Evelyn even called me. I was already on my way here." Julian squeezed his hand. He didn't want to let go. "They told me it was stress," Julian said softly. "That I can't keep pushing like this." "Then stop pushing," Liam whispered. "Let someone else carry it for a while." Julian turned his head, their eyes meeting in the quiet. "Will you stay?" "I'm not going anywhere," Liam said. "Not this time." And for the first time in what felt like years, Julian let the weight settle. He stopped resisting the ache in his chest, the tremble in his limbs, the fear he had been swallowing whole. He let Liam hold it for him. They stayed like that through the evening, as the city outside dimmed and softened under rain. The television played quietly in the background, voices muffled. The monitor beside him beeped in steady time. Julian drifted in and out, but each time he surfaced, Liam was still there. And somewhere between one breath and the next, Julian realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to trust. The lake house sat quiet under a canvas of overcast sky, tucked into a bend of trees that held their gold and copper leaves close, as if unwilling to release them to the season's pull. The air was cool and damp, with the scent of moss and old wood. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, disappearing into the clouds that had pressed low all afternoon. The gravel driveway had been muffled by last night's rain, the stones damp beneath Julian's shoes as he stepped out of the SUV. Liam was already on the porch, leaning against the railing with his hands in the pockets of a flannel jacket that looked older than either of them. His eyes followed the ripple of water beyond the trees, slow and thoughtful. When Julian approached, Liam didn't smile, but his gaze softened in a way that told Julian everything he needed to know. He was welcome here. The front door creaked as they stepped inside. The cabin breathed with the warmth of the fire crackling in the stone hearth, and the scent of cedar and dried herbs clung to the air like an old memory. There was no glass, no steel, no flicker of tech, just wood and stone, and the hush that came when a place was made for silence. Julian dropped his bag beside the couch and exhaled as though his bones had been holding breath since the city. His chest still ached faintly when he pushed too hard or moved too fast, but the doctors had cleared him with warnings and timelines, and a list of things he was supposed to stop doing that he already knew he would ignore. Liam watched him ease down into the couch, one hand pressed lightly to his chest. "You okay?" he asked. Julian nodded, leaning his head back against the cushion. "I am now." Liam didn't reply, just crossed to the kitchen and pulled down 2 mugs. The kettle was already warm on the stove. They moved in quiet rhythm, not needing words. The distance between them had faded into something gentle, something careful. They sat together, tea in hand, wrapped in the hush of falling light and crackling fire. "You didn't have to come," Liam said after a while. Julian looked at him. "I wanted to. I mean, all this. Leaving your company in the middle of a crisis, walking away from the board, the press." Julian tilted his head. "You say that like it cost me something." "Didn't it?" Julian's voice lowered. "Only if I still thought any of that mattered more than this." He reached across the space between them and brushed the back of Liam's hand with his fingers. The contact was light but deliberate, a tether in the silence. Liam looked down, his thumb tracing the rim of the mug. "It's hard," he said quietly, "letting people in again, trusting they'll stay." "I know," Julian said. Liam's eyes lifted. "Do you?" Julian leaned forward, setting his mug on the table. He took Liam's hand fully this time, lacing their fingers together. "I know what it's like to build a life so carefully you forget it was supposed to be lived. I know what it's like to lose people. Not to death, always. Sometimes to ambition, sometimes to fear. And I know what it feels like to almost lose yourself chasing something that never loved you back." Liam watched him, the weight of those words settling deep. "What are we doing, Julian?" Julian breathed in slowly, the fire's warmth brushing the side of his face. "We're trying," he said, "and for the first time, I don't want to run from that." The words hung between them, honest and unfinished. Later, they walked to the edge of the lake, boots crunching over fallen leaves, the wind lifting the ends of their sleeves and slipping beneath scarves. The sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting the water in shades of pewter and silver. Ducks floated near the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called, its voice rising in a lonely, tremulous cry. Liam glanced at Julian, who walked with his hands tucked into his coat, eyes flicking from sky to shore. "You ever think about disappearing?" Liam asked. Julian smiled faintly. All the time, not just for a weekend, for good, leaving it all behind. Julian's steps slowed. He turned his head, searching Liam's expression. I used to think that was failure, he said. But now it sounds a little like freedom. They stood there a moment, water lapping softly at the shore. Julian's voice was quieter when he spoke again. What if we built something that didn't need to be hidden? Not a company, not a performance, something real. Liam looked at him, heart tugging with something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or something wilder than hope. Possibility. I wouldn't know where to start, he said. Julian's hand brushed his again, warm in the chill. Start here, Julian said. With me. They returned to the cabin as dusk folded into night. Julian cooked while Liam chopped vegetables, their bodies moving around each other in comfortable proximity. The kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic, the pop of oil in the pan, the low hum of a song Julian played on his phone, old jazz and soft vocals. They ate by the fire, legs stretched toward the hearth, shoulders touching, and when the meal was done and the dishes left for morning, Julian turned to Liam and touched his cheek. Will you stay here with me tonight? Liam didn't answer. He just leaned in and kissed him, slow and steady, a yes made of breath and lips and trust. In the small bedroom, beneath flannel sheets and the creak of old wood settling into sleep, they undressed one another without urgency. Julian traced the lines of Liam's back with reverent fingers, the curve of his ribs, the pulse in his neck. Liam kissed Julian's chest, the place where his heart had faltered and returned, where life had been lost and found again. Their bodies came together, not in desperation, but in something deeper, something like recognition, like healing. After, they lay quiet in the dark, their breathing slow and syncopated. Julian curled closer, resting his forehead against Liam's temple. You were the first thing I saw when I came back, he murmured. And somehow I think you've been there ever since. Liam didn't speak, but his hand tightened gently over Julian's, grounding them both in the truth of it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The lake held its silence. And inside the warmth of the cabin, two men rested in the slow, patient unfolding of something that felt like the beginning of a life they had almost stopped believing in. The sun lifted over the lake in a slow exhale of gold, casting the still water in a shimmer that reached toward the windows of the cabin. Light crept across the floorboards, brushing the edges of the worn rug and the low bookshelf where Julian's half-read novels leaned against each other like tired travelers. Birds called gently through the trees, their notes thin and clear against the hush of morning. Inside, the only sound was the soft shift of linen as Julian rose from bed, careful not to wake Liam. He stood barefoot at the window, arms crossed over his chest, a quiet heat pooling in him that had nothing to do with the sunlight. Liam slept on his stomach, one arm thrown across Julian's side of the bed, face half buried in the pillow. His hair curled slightly from sleep, and his mouth was parted just enough to make Julian's breath catch with tenderness. In the weeks since they had arrived, the silence between them had grown not colder but deeper, weighted with understanding, with trust. They had built no declarations, no promises spoken into air, but each gesture, each glance, each word had pressed another stone into the foundation of something real. Julian had stopped checking his inbox before sunrise. He had let the staff at his company shift without him, left the boardroom battles to men who still believed they were kings. At first, it had been difficult. Letting go always was. But then something had softened. He no longer woke with the sharp edge of obligation scraping at his ribs. He no longer watched the hours as a countdown to his own exhaustion. Now, he watched Liam sleep. He brewed coffee in the small kitchen, the scent filling the air in rich, familiar strokes. When the floor creaked under his step, Liam stirred. He blinked into the light, then smiled when he saw Julian standing there with two mugs in hand. "You're up early," Liam murmured, voice hoarse from sleep. Julian handed him the coffee, brushing the hair from his forehead. "I wanted to watch the sunrise with you." Liam sat up, pulling the blanket around his waist, steam curling from the mug between his palms. His eyes were still heavy, but they met Julian's with steady clarity. "You've changed," he said softly. Julian tilted his head, half smiling. "For the better?" "For the braver," Liam said. They dressed slowly that morning, neither speaking of plans, because for the first time plans felt optional. Julian took Liam's hand as they walked the narrow trail that curved around the water. Leaves crunched beneath their boots, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine needles warming in the light. Every few steps, Liam would glance sideways at Julian, as if to confirm he was still there, still real, still his. By the time they returned, the sun was high enough to cast shadows that moved with them across the porch. Julian paused at the front steps, pulling Liam to a gentle stop. "I've been thinking," Julian said, his voice quiet and clear, "about what comes next." Liam's hand stayed in his thumb, moving lightly over the curve of Julian's knuckle. "So have I." "I can't go back," Julian said. "Not in the way they want, not to the version of me that made everyone else comfortable and me empty." "I wouldn't want you to," Liam said. Julian exhaled slowly. "I want to build something different, not just a life, but something that matters, a place for people like us, people who've lost, who've broken, who've put themselves back together too many times, a foundation, a space for healing, for rest, for second chances." Liam's expression shifted, something softening behind his eyes. He nodded once. "You're talking about more than just us." "I'm talking about building a home," Julian said. "Not just for us, but for others who've needed one too long." Liam looked out over the water, the thoughts settling into him like roots threading into earth. "Then let's do it," he said. Julian smiled, and the breath he didn't know he'd been holding left him. That evening, they sat on the dock, wrapped in a blanket, wine in hand, their feet dangling over the edge. The air had turned cool, the lake darkening to ink. Stars broke through the sky like glints of something eternal. Julian leaned his head against Liam's shoulder, the rhythm of their breathing matching without effort. "I never imagined this," Julian said softly. "What?" "That something so simple could feel like everything I ever wanted." Liam turned to him, brushing his lips against Julian's hair. "Maybe that's what love is." Julian let the words settle. He didn't reply, not because he didn't feel it, but because he did, so fully it had no place left to hide. 2 weeks later, they drove north. They followed winding roads into a sleepy Vermont town, past fields dappled with frost, and old red barns leaning into hills. They met with realtors, with architects, with veterans, and retired medics, and burned-out nurses. They listened more than they spoke, asked questions instead of offering solutions. Julian used his name carefully, not as leverage, but as a door held open. Liam stood beside him every step, quiet but certain, translating the vision into something lived. When a retired firefighter named Cam spoke of losing 3 friends to suicide in the last year, Liam reached for Julian's hand and held it tight enough to be felt. They bought an old inn with tall windows and creaky floors, where the wallpaper peeled in places but the light always found its way in. They walked through each room together, imagining gardens out back, a library filled with quiet, a kitchen that never closed. They painted the walls in warm colors and left the scars in the wood floors untouched. They called it Hearth. And when they hung the sign out front, when the first guests arrived with their duffels and hollow eyes, Julian stood behind the counter and smiled like someone who had finally arrived somewhere he had been trying to reach all his life. That night, they stood on the porch, wrapped in the same old blanket, the stars bright above them. Julian turned to Liam, pulled something from his pocket. Not a ring, not yet. A small, folded piece of paper, the note Liam had left that first morning. He handed it to Liam. Liam opened it slowly, stared down at the 3 words he had written in fear. Julian leaned in, his voice barely a breath. "You're ready now." And Liam, eyes bright and full of all the places he had once been lost, whispered the only thing left to say. "Yes." Snow drifted lazily outside the tall windows, soft flakes spinning in gentle spirals before settling onto the stone path that wound through the trees. The world had gone quiet under the hush of winter, wrapped in a silvery stillness that muted every sound and made each moment feel suspended, like breath held between heartbeats. Inside the house, warm light spilled from lanterns strung across the beams of the ceiling, casting a golden glow over worn wooden floors and the soft ripple of linen napkins folded on the long dining table. Liam stood in front of the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, his gaze drawn to the fire as it breathed and shifted. The flames curled around logs with lazy purpose, casting dancing shadows on the walls behind him. He wore a slate-gray shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a thin silver ring glinting on his left hand. His face held the quiet of someone who had learned the value of peace and chosen to keep it close. Behind him, laughter rose from the kitchen. The guest duo nurses who had arrived the day before, a retired paramedic and his dog, a young firefighter with tired eyeshad, found their way to comfort. It happened like that, slowly, over cups of coffee and shared silences, until something soft settled among them. It wasn't magic. It was something harder, earned, nurtured, safe. Julian emerged from the hallway with a fresh log cradled in his arms, his wool sweater dusted with bark and pine. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his hair pushed back from his forehead, and when he looked up and saw Liam by the fire, his eyes lit with something private and steady. "You've been standing there a long time," Julian said, voice low and warm. Liam turned to him, a slow smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Just thinking." Julian knelt at the fireplace and fed the log into the flames, then stood and brushed his hands on his jeans. He crossed to Liam, slipping an arm around his waist, pressing a kiss to the side of his neck. "What about?" Liam leaned into the touch. "About the day I found you in that penthouse. I keep wondering what would have happened if I had been even a minute later." Julian's arms tightened slightly. "Then this wouldn't exist. This fire. This house. This moment." Liam turned, resting his forehead against Julian's. "It still doesn't feel real sometimes. Like I borrowed someone else's life." Julian smiled against his lips. "Maybe we both did." They stayed like that until the kettle whistled. Julian pulled away, his hand trailing along Liam's side as he moved to the kitchen. Liam watched him, watched the ease with which he moved now. There was still a scar on Julian's chest, thin and pale, just under the line of his collarbone. A reminder, a beginning. He poured the tea and returned with 2 mugs, handing one to Liam. Steam rose between them, scented with mint and orange peel. "Do you remember," Julian said, "what I said to you the first night here?" Liam took a sip, the warmth sliding through him in slow waves. "You said you wanted to build something real." Julian nodded. "And I didn't know then what it would look like. I just knew I wanted to build it with you." Liam's voice dropped. "We did." They sat by the fire as the snow deepened outside. The world had folded itself into a quiet cocoon, the kind of night that invited memory and gentle silence. Liam set his mug on the floor beside him and leaned back into Julian's chest, his head finding the hollow between shoulder and neck. "I got a letter," Julian said after a while. "From the board." Liam shifted slightly. "Good or bad?" Julian chuckled softly. "Mostly confused. They asked if I was serious about not coming back. They offered a consultant position, flexible hours, remote. And? I told them I already have a full-time job, running Hearth, being in love." Liam looked up at him, eyes narrowing with mock suspicion. "You told them you're in love?" Julian kissed his temple. Only the part about the job. The rest they'll figure out when they see the next photo of us in a tabloid." Liam laughed, low and unguarded. "You're not afraid of that anymore?" Julian shook his head. "Not anymore. Not with you beside me." The doorbell rang, distant and musical. Liam stood first, brushing lint from his shirt. When he opened the door, icy air rushed in, and with it came a woman wrapped in a green scarf, her cheeks pink from the cold. She held a suitcase in one hand and a letter in the other. "Hi," she said. "I'm here for the weekend, I think. I think I'm supposed to be here." Liam smiled, stepping aside. "You are. Welcome to Hearth." Julian watched from the living room as the woman entered slowly, her eyes scanning the space with a cautious kind of hope. She was alone, but not lonely. Not anymore. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet rhythm of conversation and soft music. Liam moved through the rooms, checking in on guests, adjusting pillows, refilling glasses. Julian watched him from the archway near the staircase, the way his presence softened everyone around him, the way he carried the space like it was sacred. Later, when the house had quieted and the fire had burned low, they stood outside beneath a sky smudged with stars. The trees were bare and black against the glittering cold, and the air smelled of snow and smoke. Julian took Liam's hand and pressed something small and cold into his palm. Liam looked down. A silver ring, simple, smooth, no inscription, just weight. Julian's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not because I need to own you, not because we need a ceremony, just because I want you to know there's nowhere else I want to be but with you in every way." Liam stared at the ring, then at Julian, and the quiet between them cracked wide open with feeling. "I don't need anything but this," he said, "but I want it all, with you." Julian slid the ring onto Liam's finger, his hands steady, his breath held. Liam leaned in, kissed him with the kind of love that no longer had edges. When they returned inside, the warmth met them like an old friend. Julian glanced once over his shoulder at the snow still falling and the cabin glowing behind them. He thought of that night, so long ago, when he had woken on the floor with a stranger's hands pressing life back into him. He thought of how everything had changed, and how, somehow, that stranger had become his future. The man who had saved his life had not just pulled him back from the edge. He had taught him how to live again,